Eliza Marsh had learned to hold her breath before bad news arrived, as if that could somehow soften the blow. She was holding it now, standing in the doorway of the small house she had shared with her husband before he died, watching a stranger step down from a black wagon with papers in his hand. Her daughter Grace, only 7 months old, slept against her shoulder, warm and unaware. Eliza pressed her lips to the baby's soft hair and tried to steady herself. "Mrs. Marsh," the man said. His name was Silas Boone, and he ran cattle on the far side of the valley. He had a reputation, one that made the other women in town lower their voices when they spoke of him. "Your husband owed me a great deal of money before he passed. I have come to collect." "I have nothing," Eliza said. "You can see that for yourself. The house is bare. I sold the furniture months ago." Boone smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Then we will have to find another way for you to settle the debt." What followed was the worst hour of Eliza's life. Boone's men loaded her few belongings into the wagon, while he explained, in a calm voice that made her skin crawl, that she and Grace would come to work at his ranch until the debt was paid. Everyone in town knew what that meant for the women who went to work for Silas Boone. None of them stayed there by choice for long, and none of them ever seemed to leave with anything they had started with. Eliza had no family left to turn to, no money, and no way to fight a man with lawyers and hired hands. She climbed into the wagon with Grace held tight against her chest, and she told herself she would find a way to protect her daughter, even if she did not yet know how. The wagon rolled out of town in the late afternoon, heading toward the mountains, where Boone's land began. Clouds had been gathering all day, heavy and gray, and by the time they reached the narrow mountain road, snow had begun to fall in thick, silent sheets. The driver, a rough man named Cutter, cursed under his breath as the wheels slipped on the icy path. Then, without warning, a section of the hillside gave way ahead of them. Rocks and mud slid down across the road, blocking it completely. The horses reared in fright, and Cutter fought to keep them from bolting. "This road is finished," Cutter shouted over the wind. "I'm not losing my horses to a mountain in a storm." He unhitched the team, mounted one horse, and led the other away, leaving the wagon, and Eliza, and Grace behind. "Wait!" Eliza called after him, but he did not look back. Snow fell faster now, and the wind cut through her thin coat like a blade. She climbed down from the wagon, wrapping Grace as tightly as she could inside her own shawl, and looked around at the darkening mountain. There was no house in sight, no light, nothing but rock and pine trees bending under the weight of the storm. She began to walk, because standing still felt like giving up, and giving up was not something she could allow herself to do while Grace depended on her. Her feet grew numb inside her worn boots. The wind stung her eyes until she could barely see the path in front of her. Grace began to cry, a thin, frightened sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm. "I'm here," Eliza whispered against the baby's ear, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I'm here." She did not know how long she walked before her legs gave out beneath her. She remembers falling to her knees in the snow, curling her body around Grace to shield her from the cold, and thinking that this, at least, was a kinder ending than what waited for her at Boone's ranch. That was when she heard the dog barking. Caleb Renner had lived alone in the mountains for 6 years. He trapped in winter, hunted in the fall, and grew what he could in a small garden behind his cabin in the warmer months. He spoke to almost no one. The nearest town was a full day's ride away, and he rarely made the trip unless he was low on salt or ammunition. Most people in the valley had heard of him, the quiet mountain man who kept to himself, but few had ever actually spoken with him. He had not always been alone. Years before, he had a wife, Anna, and a small son. A fever had swept through their settlement one hard winter and taken them both within the same week. Caleb had buried them on a hillside behind the cabin he built for his family, and after that, the mountain silence had felt like the only place that made sense to him. People asked too many questions. The mountain asked nothing at all. That evening, as the storm worsened, his dog, an old hound named Scout, began barking at the door and would not stop. Caleb finally pulled on his coat and stepped outside to see what had disturbed him, expecting a bear or a stray elk. Instead, following Scout through the blinding snow, he found a woman collapsed on the ground. a baby wrapped inside her shawl, both of them dangerously still. He did not hesitate. He lifted Eliza in his arms, baby and all, and carried them both back to his cabin, moving as fast as the deep snow allowed. Inside, he laid her near the fire and worked quickly, wrapping her in every blanket he owned, warming water, checking that the baby was still breathing. Grace let out a weak cry, which Caleb took as a good sign. Eliza stirred sometime later, her eyes fluttering open in confusion at the unfamiliar room, the crackling fire, and the tall, quiet man kneeling beside her. She sat up so fast that pain shot through her stiff limbs, pulling Grace closer to her chest, her whole body tensed for whatever might come next. She had been at the mercy of men before, and it had rarely gone well. "You're safe," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "You collapsed in the snow. I brought you inside." "Where am I?" Eliza asked, her voice hoarse. "My cabin, about 2 miles up from the old mountain road." He nodded toward the baby. "She seems all right. A little cold, but breathing fine." Eliza looked around the small cabin, taking in the simple furniture, the neatly stacked firewood, the single bed in the corner that Caleb had clearly given up for her without being asked. She braced herself, waiting for him to name his price for the rescue, the way men so often did. Instead, Caleb stood, walked to the door, took his own bedroll from beside the bed, and said simply, "I'll sleep outside on the porch tonight. Storm's letting up some. You and the baby take the bed." "You don't have to do that," Eliza said quickly. "It's your home." "I've slept in worse places than my own porch," Caleb answered. "You get some rest." He left before she could argue further, and Eliza sat by the fire for a long time afterward, staring at the closed door, trying to understand a kindness she had not expected and did not entirely trust yet. The snow kept the mountain pass closed for nearly 3 weeks. In that time, Eliza and Grace stayed in Caleb's cabin, and slowly, carefully, something between them began to shift. At first, Eliza kept her guard up completely. She thanked Caleb for his help, but she watched him closely, waiting for the moment his patience would run out, the moment he would ask something of her in return for shelter and food. That moment never came. Caleb was quiet, but not unkind. He split extra firewood without being asked. He fashioned a small blanket sling so Eliza could carry Grace and still have her hands free to help around the cabin, something she insisted on doing once she felt strong enough, unwilling to feel like a burden. He never raised his voice, never made her feel small, and never once looked at her the way Boone and men like him had looked at her. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the window, Eliza finally asked him about the small wooden markers she had noticed on the hillside behind the cabin. Caleb was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "My wife, Anna, and our boy, Thomas. Fever took them both, 6 winters back." His voice was flat, the practiced calm of a man who had said the words to himself many times, but rarely spoken them aloud to another person. "I built this cabin for them before they died. Never saw much reason to leave it after." "I'm so sorry," Eliza said softly. "It was a long time ago." He looked over at Grace, who was sleeping peacefully in the small bed they had made for her out of a wooden crate and soft blankets. House got quiet after that. Real quiet. He paused. "It hasn't been quiet since you two arrived." Eliza found herself telling him her own story in return, about her husband's death, about the debts she had not known existed until Boone arrived at her door, about being handed over like an item in a ledger to settle accounts she had never agreed to. Caleb listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening more than once, though he said nothing about it at the time. As the weeks passed, Eliza began to notice the small things Caleb did without ever asking for thanks. He carved a tiny wooden rattle for Grace and left it beside her crate one morning without a word. He noticed when Eliza's boots were falling apart and, without mentioning it, left a sturdier pair by the door, ones he had clearly resized and repaired himself. He was careful never to crowd her, never to make her feel as though her safety came with any conditions attached. For the first time since her husband died, Eliza began to feel something other than fear. She still did not know what to call it, but it felt something like hope. Then, one afternoon, a neighbor from the far side of the valley rode up to the cabin with news. Silas Boone had been asking questions in every settlement along the mountain, offering money to anyone who could tell him where the widow Marsh and her baby had gone. He claimed she was his property, bought and owed to him, and he intended to collect what belonged to him. Eliza's hands trembled as she listened. She had let herself believe, these past weeks, that the mountain might keep her hidden and safe, now that hope felt fragile again. "He has no real claim on you," Caleb said once the neighbor had ridden off. "A man can't buy a person, not by law, not by anything decent. Debts don't work that way, not for a person, only for property." "Try telling him that," Eliza said. "Try telling the men he pays to enforce whatever he decides is his." Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Your husband's debts. Do you know if they were ever recorded properly with the territorial office? A debt like that should have papers, official ones, not just Boone's word." Eliza shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I never saw any papers. Boone simply arrived and said it was owed." "Then I'll find out," Caleb said. Despite Eliza's protests, Caleb rode out early the next morning, pushing through the last of the melting snow toward the territorial recorder's office 2 days away, determined to learn the truth about the debt before Boone could act on his threats. Eliza spent those days pacing the small cabin, jumping at every sound, terrified that Boone's men would find them before Caleb returned. He came back on the evening of the third day, exhausted, his horse lathered from hard riding, but with a folded paper held carefully inside his coat. "Your husband's debt was recorded," he said, handing her the paper once he had warmed himself by the fire, "but it was already paid in full, through the sale of his tools and equipment after he passed. Boone has no legal claim on you at all. He never did." Eliza stared at the paper in disbelief, reading the official stamp at the bottom, the recorder's careful handwriting confirming what Caleb had said. "He lied to me. He lied to everyone. Men like Boone count on people not knowing their rights, and not having anyone willing to check," Caleb said quietly. "You do now." Boone arrived at the cabin 3 days later, exactly as they had feared, with 2 hired men riding beside him. Eliza's heart pounded as she watched them approach from the window, but Caleb stepped out onto the porch calmly, rifle resting easily in his hands, and met them before they had even fully dismounted. "You're on my land," Caleb said, his voice steady and clear. "I've come for what's owed to me," Boone said. "The widow Marsh and her child belong to me until her debt is paid." Caleb held up the folded paper. "According to the territorial recorder, that debt was paid in full months ago. You have no claim here, Boone, and you never did. I'd think carefully before you try to take what isn't yours, especially with paper proof standing against you." Boone's face reddened with anger, but his eyes flickered toward the rifle in Caleb's hands, and toward the steady, unshaken look on his face. Whatever Boone had expected to find at the end of his search, it clearly was not a mountain man willing to stand his ground with the law on his side. After a long, tense moment, Boone turned his horse around without another word, his men following close behind, and rode back down the mountain, empty-handed. Eliza let out a breath she felt she had been holding for weeks, watching from the window as the last of the danger disappeared down the trail. That evening, once Grace had been fed and settled to sleep, Eliza found herself standing near the door, thinking about what came next. Boone was gone, the danger had passed, and she no longer had a reason to stay in a stranger's cabin, taking up space that was not hers. "I suppose we should think about moving on," she said quietly, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. "I don't want to keep imposing on you." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "You're not imposing, Eliza. Not on me, and not on this house." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "This cabin has been too quiet for a long time. Since you and Grace came here, it doesn't feel empty anymore. I don't want it to go back to that." Eliza looked up at him, searching his face for the meaning behind his words. "I'm not offering you charity," Caleb continued. "I'm asking you to stay, if you want to, not because you owe me anything, and not because you have nowhere else to go, because I'd like it, if you and Grace made a home here, with me." Tears filled Eliza's eyes, though this time they were not tears of fear. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was asking her, not taking from her, not deciding her future without her consent. She had a choice, and it was entirely her own to make. "I'll be your family now," Caleb said softly, "if you'll let me." Eliza stepped closer, Grace stirring gently in her arms, and answered the only way that felt true. "Yes," she whispered, "we'll stay." Spring came slowly to the mountain that year, melting the last of the snow into clear streams that ran down past the cabin. Eliza planted small flowers by the door, their bright colors a quiet promise against the gray rock and dark pine trees. Grace grew stronger every day, learning to crawl across the wooden floor, then to pull herself up on unsteady legs, always watched closely by two people who loved her. Caleb, once a man of few words and fewer visitors, found his quiet cabin filled with laughter again, small and uncertain at first, then steady and sure, the way spring always follows even the hardest winter. He taught Eliza to read the mountain weather, to know when storms were coming, and when the sky promised only clear, calm days ahead. What had begun as the worst day of Eliza's life, sold to settle a debt she never owed, abandoned in a storm on a mountain road, had somehow led her to exactly where she was always meant to be. Not bought, not owned, not taken by anyone. Chosen, freely, by a quiet man who had once lost everything, and who had opened his door, and eventually his heart, to a stranger and her child in the middle of a snowstorm, asking for nothing in return but the chance to be their family.